Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Everyone can hear me fine? All right, thank you so much for coming to this session. We are all really excited to have a lively discussion today around balancing equitable access with security, and then how can we go about measuring performance. So I am Tiffany Andrews. I'm the head of product at Login.gov, which is inside of General Service Administration. I have a lovely panel of people here that are going to be sharing different insights, key findings, frameworks, processes, challenges on how we can go about doing this. And for sure, as you all know, there is no solution yet, but we're all working collaboratively together. One of the reasons why I really wanted to have this panel discussion was around the challenges that I saw so far at Login.gov around how can we serve all of the American population, regardless of citizenship status, regardless if they're banked, underbanked, if they have a state-issued ID or passport. And so I know many of you know some of those challenges around that within accessing digital identity services. And so we just really wanted to be able to have an open discussion about that so that we can collaboratively work together on how can we address these issues. So first I'm going to go ahead and start with Dr. Stephanie Shuckers, who is a professor in the Department of Engineering at Clarkson University and serves as the director for the Center of Identification Technology Services, also known as CITER. Dr. Shuckers' research focuses on processing and interpreting signals which arise from human interactions. In 2023, she was named IEEE Fellow and serves as the Board of Director for Biometric Institute.
Thank you for having me. And so I just in the last session was talking about remote identity verification technology. And so, when we talk about accessibility and equitable access, these are one of the technologies that are relatively new, really do help with security in terms of onboarding, particularly in remote environments, but use documents and biometrics. So there's a lot of questions around accessibility and equity as it relates to these technologies. And essentially what they do, you take a photo of your driver's license or you query it through near field communication, NFC, and then it checks the validity of the document. Then you take a selfie, and then you do a biometric match against the document, and then there's a liveness check to make sure it's a legitimate person right there at that time. And so that's what we're focused on. And so in CITER, we've been working on a study with a government agency and looking at almost 4,000 individuals across age, gender, economic status, as well as skin tone and race, ethnicity. And so we are super excited to see the results. We don't have the official results yet, but we are working very hard on the methodology on how to do this. And so you didn't think you would see something related to statistics, I can't even say it, at this conference. I have people saying to me, I had that class. And so bad memories, but when we think about measurement, we need to also think about uncertainty, because we can take and slice and dice groups of individuals and look at performance, and you're going to see differences, right? Period. That's just, the nature of people. Right? But the question is are those significant differences? Are they measurable? Is it something we can measure with the population that we have in our study? And so you need bounds, which you probably remember that from your class. And so what we've done is developed a methodology to allow us to look when performance for a specific demographic group may be outside of our bounds and thus a concern, right? And so then having that methodology then allows us to do, analysis, data science, right? To look within our study, for our research, for a specific study, but also to monitor that as time goes on, because technology changes, and we want to ensure that our solutions are working well for all. And so there's a lot there on that chart. I'm not going to go into all of it, but really it's about, that's my phone, error rates and looking for ones that are outside the bounds. And, pink is not good, that is an example. And blue is more favorable performance, which is kind of interesting also that we should look at. And then we can look across solutions. So we're excited that we will be announcing results for that study later this year. And we have a lot more questions. So when there is errors, and we don't want errors, why are we getting those errors? How can we improve our technology so we don't get those errors? And many of you may know that NIST does amazing testing, but they're focused on the matcher. So some of the work that we're doing by looking at the end-to-end performance is not just facial matching, but also how well does the document verification work? How well does the capture work? It's not easy to capture good pictures of documents. Not easy to capture good selfies. You may know that. My kids are good at it, but they tell me that I am not. Liveness, too. Liveness has accessibility and equity concerns also. So we got a lot of work ahead of us, and super excited to announce those results later this year. And hopefully I didn't take more than my 3 minutes.
No, you're fine. Next up, we have Jordan Burris. He's the VP and Head of Public Sector Strategy at Socure. He partners with government leaders to develop and scale Socure's public sector offerings for identity verification and fraud risk management. Prior to that, he was the Chief of Staff for the USCIO in the White House. He is also a board member of the Identity Theft Resource Center and the Kantara Initiative.
Thank you. And I'm excited to be here today to be able to talk with everyone. As you can see, I wear a lot of hats. And in particular, this means that I get to look at the question or challenge around identity and what we're doing to better serve the public, ultimately from different viewpoints and lenses, right? So I'm going to break them up into a couple of different areas. One, I would say that there's been this long-standing recognition that more needs to be done to make identity technologies, just in particular, more inclusive and equitable for different demographics, right? It's long been put on the back burner. I always say that much of what is our identity infrastructure is fragmented, is broken, and it doesn't actually work for everyone. Now, of course, I can't always be all doom and gloom. There are promising areas in terms of like what we need to do to improve. I would say in efforts such as what Kantara is doing, we're working through with a number of vendors in the space. Opened up to government agencies, is opened up to academia, et cetera, to basically talk through what would it look like to have more equitable technologies, and more importantly, how do you measure and quantify that? In particular. So for those that didn't get to see the Kantara talk earlier this week, please stop by the booth. We would love to have more participants in the discussion there. From the Socure lens, in particular, as a company that is obsessed with confirming that everyone can get through the identity proofing process or identity verification process in an equitable manner, we look at better understanding and resolving systemic gaps in how we've gone about verifying individuals to date. Something we'll talk about as part of this panel is one of the research reports that we recently released around America's digital ghost, and really starts to talk about the widening scale and to where we're leaving certain parts of the population behind in their ability to verify who they are ultimately.
Thanks, Jordan. Next up, we have John Prisby. He is the lead of the Biometric and Identity Technology Center within the Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology. Prior to his time at DHS, he worked as a senior product manager at several startups in the healthcare, supply risk management, and artificial intelligence industry.
Hi, my name's John. As mentioned, I think, to put it simply, try to work to make identity a bit less of a religion and more of a math problem. So I'm actually just curious here by hands. I would bet most people here have a software or computer science background, IT generally, 50, 60%. So identity as a translational science is fairly kind of young. So what we don't look at is like, criminology, if you're trying to understand bad actors, social science, geography, so like deterministics. There's a lot of things that when you really like take a step back and say it's not just computers, it's not just IT systems, it's not just digital. So what I'm going to talk about today a little bit and more in a session tomorrow is if you take a step back and actually look at a part of the U.S. identity ecosystem, the reason you actually will not hear me say the word digital is something like the U.S. has done well is civil registry. Most people here probably have a birth certificate. We conduct a census every 10 years. There's some basic things that do function, have functioned for a long time. When you look at gaps or divides, I would actually argue that a lot in this community, like we tend to navel gaze and look at very specific pieces of things and ignore. As I heard someone put it funny I think yesterday, was we spend some time trying to circumcise the mosquito when really there's lots of other challenges that are bigger and are ignored. So if we look at try to understand people, we're trying to get people access to a process, and if it works well, you don't even notice it. If it doesn't work, you do because it's a blocker. So looking at taking a step back and saying, well, population, it's people. So if you look at, we're people, we get stressed. So in the case like disaster response, if your house was destroyed, you're typically stressed out. And your documents may have been gone, and you may or may not have access. So what's challenging for DHS cases, at least, is FEMA sees you on an event basis. They don't know you, because usually, if you've had your house destroyed 4 times, you've typically had really bad luck. It's being struck by lightning several times. It happens, but it's rare. There's push to get it out quickly because these communities have been devastated. And thirdly, people are in the worst state of their mind. So if you try to ask them to do a complex new task like identity proofing, it's really hard. Think about if you haven't slept for 3 days trying to do something like DACA, taking selfies, others. So I think it's looking at a social science lens of looking at less the IT, because that's fairly covered in lots of places, but looking at drawing from public health, drawing from finance. Where do we already have statistical data at a population level to understand how well things work? What are the processes? What is the evidence that is collected either in paper or otherwise? And how do we actually understand that better? Because if we don't, then we're just focusing very narrowly in some technical aspects while ignoring other potentially glaring gaps that we may not even have defined well.
And last up, we have Ariel Kennan. She is the Senior Director at the Beck Center of Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University, where she researches and advises on advancing design, data, and technology for accessible and equitable delivery and public benefits. Previously, she served in the New York City Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity and was the Director of Civic Innovation at Sidewalk Labs.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, everyone, enjoying my first Identiverse and an honor to get to speak here. I wanted to give you a little bit of context because I not only work at a university, but we're focused on public benefits delivery. Not everyone here is from the U.S., and not everyone knows how the government works, even if you are from the U.S. So we work largely on what's considered the core economic, social, and health support programs. They are funded at the federal level, and some of the administrative funding comes from the federal level, but then actually delivered at the state, local, tribal, and territorial level, which creates a very unique landscape. It means there's also a ton of technology that's in those systems. And so in our program at the Beck Center, the Digital Benefits Network is really focused on helping support the kind of coordination across the ecosystem of players, which includes nonprofits and all the levels of government, academic partners, and of course, industry and private sector, who are a huge part of in particular, the technology delivery. We create some tools and resources, including the Digital Benefits Hub, which has tools from across the ecosystem on it in addition to our research. I'll share a little bit more about some of the identity-focused work we've been doing. We also support peer communities of practice where cross-sector practitioners can come together and learn together and hopefully create new solutions together. And then we do create a lot of space for learning and really thinking about the futures of delivery and technology and where things are headed at a larger scale, not just in benefits delivery, and come back and bring some of that back into the benefits space. Please feel free to check us out on our website and follow us on social. During the pandemic, the federal government really stood up an incredible support system of programs that allowed for Americans to get assistance and cash in their hands, but obviously also probably prevented a full economic collapse or a major recession in the U.S. The bad thing that happened alongside that was that a lot of hackers, cyber criminals, nation states, you name it, took huge advantage of these legacy old systems, some that are running on mainframe, COBOL. They were built in the 70s or 80s. They were using really bad identity practices like knowledge-based verification. And guess what? Billions of dollars were stolen. And so in response, a lot of state governments started rolling out new solutions, in particular using a lot of biometrics, which was pretty new in the benefits space. There just wasn't much of that yet. And so this raised really a question for us of what's actually happening, what programs is it impacting, and how can we, one, help it in the right places be successful, and in the wrong places become more of a service still that people can really use. So last year we launched our data set that looks at how both authentication and proofing are used in the core 6 public benefits programs in all of the states and territories that deliver those programs. That is available as an open data set. You can download it and use it however you'd like. We've heard a lot of great cross-sector feedback. There's also a full set of analysis as well as data visualization in the website. And we're actually updating this data this summer. And so we'd love, if you look at it or you're a user of it, we would love to hear feedback on it and ideas about how you might want to use it or change about it. We are also launching a digital identity community of practice to support cross-sector practitioners working in the benefits space as they navigate choices and decisions in the authentication and proofing space. And we also have some new research that we'll be announcing very soon. So if you're interested in kind of this general space, please give us a follow so you get that announcement.
Okay, so let's go ahead and kick off with what are some of the use cases and examples that might not be as well known around inequitability and access in authentication and identity verification.
So I'm always happy to kick it off. And so I talked a little bit about that digital ghost research that we were doing at Secure. So in particular, digital ghosts, for those not familiar with the term, mainly because we're coining it as marketing teams tend to do, it plays into those who, for whatever reason, do not have some of the foundational elements that have long been used in legacy processes for identity verification to confirm who they are. Think about today, across the U.S. at least, there's a heavy reliance on the credit ecosystem in order to serve as a proxy for who someone is. This translates into, folks, sometimes when you're verifying your identity, they ask, where'd you last live 3 years ago? What was the color of that car that you had? And that I never remember in particular. Right, that's one flavor of it. Another flavor of it is having some foundational evidence that you can provide. This can be in the form of what would be a driver's license, a state-issued ID, maybe that birth certificate or social security card. There are a number of reasons why people fall through those cracks and they become digital ghosts. But more importantly, what we found through some of our research is that some of the hardest impacted groups today are Generation Z and those who are legal immigrants coming to the country. Now, in particular, some would say, well, Generation Z, they're more digitally inclined. It should be easier for them to verify their identity online. No, because technically they're not within the credit ecosystem, especially since they are the younger population in particular. What we found through some of our research was that around 35% of them were digital ghosts, with about 54% of them having some type of struggle having to validate their identity, and 51% of them having to go in person multiple times with multiple sets of documents in order to prove who they were. If we look at the immigrant population, they're also no stranger to struggle, with around 51% of them having issues being able to verify their identity. And a lot of this dovetails into gaps and things associated with being able to prove who they are, such as being able to access data, especially if you are a child who is an immigrant, being able to get that information from Homeland Security in order, due to rules and regulations and policies that are in place, to be able to get that information out to them it's difficult. in particular, and a lot of that plays into it. And so that's just some of the areas we covered in our research, but we did want to give that highlight that it's, a lot of this discussion often centers around face and documents and things along those lines when it comes to challenges with equity. It goes much further than that, especially when you're talking with identity. There is a whole underlying fabric that has long been used to verify who people are, and much of it today is still leaving out quite a large swath of the population. And with that, they then turn to not engaging, whether it be in financial services or government services in particular, and with having eroding trust ultimately, and receiving the benefits or the care that they ultimately need.
I mean, I think obviously there's a lot of challenge in the proofing. I think it's important to also just remember that basic authentication can be quite difficult for certain populations. So even just username and password or different combinations and the requirements within them. But certainly when we start adding things like multi-factor authentication, I was just talking to an advocate in a state that had a recent credential stuffing attack on their benefits portal. And in response, the state turned on MFA. All of a sudden, there was no real notification of the rollout. And this advocate was telling me how much their clients are really struggling with getting the messages. Just the texts don't always come. They sometimes lag. Sometimes their phones are out of data. They're often on like very low cost or even government sponsored plans and phones. And then a lot of people in housing incomes. Housing and income instability are doing things like sharing phones with multiple family members, so it might not even just be one person. And so I think this is where we really need to help support people with more clear instructions, thinking about the variety of ways people might be accessing things, thinking about language access, and really supporting people in whatever language they choose to participate in the program in. And I think also being really clear on the value proposition of why do you need an account? What is it actually going to do for you once you have it, to also help incentivize people to actually complete that process.
So the nice thing for an identity nerd at DHS is it literally has all of the identity problems. So just to highlight a thing too, I talked a little bit about disaster survivors. Some of the challenges when a fire, an earthquake, a hurricane, something else, heat deaths, it's geographic, so it cuts across kind of whoever's in that geography. And when you look at, to sort of build on some of it, if you look at undocumented immigrants, legal immigrants, naturally born citizens, it's almost like you live in 3 different countries identity-wise. For immigration, it's largely biometrically based, which is largely held in government records, which then can be used, but then you have to translate this to state and sort of ladder up from there. If you're domestic, it's largely documentation based, that birth certificates aren't really, it's somebody told a healthcare provider at time of birth or otherwise, and it's registered, and you sort of ladder up from there. So I think it's looking at sort of that and what is identity journeys depending upon what persona you fit in, because how you're affected, your life path is very different depending on sort of which segment you fall in. And we've been doing some work with the Research and Development Corporation, which maybe should be out later this year, early next year, to understand more like the social science. Another, just I'd say switching topics, I think it's less understood, is you look at public safety, so first responders, there's a lot of identity problems, like an example of check-in, check-out. If somebody's checked in the morning and they haven't checked back in later, they may be missing. You may have to actually go rescue them because the firefighters collapsed in the woods. So when you get into public safety, there's all of the identity problems that exist with the public, and these are the people we rely upon to help us when times are the worst. But they also have to not just deal with personal identity, but it's who are you? What skills and qualifications do you have? How has this rapidly worked in a very stressful, multi-jurisdictional environment to respond to? So there's some really interesting identity problems that get into, yes, the public is ultimately being served, but who is actually doing that service? How is that split? How are these people who we often rely upon to do this, National Guard being activated, others, but linking those together, because without those people being able to do this well and understood, the response and the support to the public will suffer.
And I'll just say for us, I talked about the research that we're doing today for the technologies we have today, but we're also thinking about, what is the technologies we want for the future. And you mentioned Gen Z, and you mentioned kind of foundational documents like birth certificates. I mean, seriously, like what we do today with a piece of paper, and a little, kind of seal of approval in terms of birth certificates is, really doesn't keep up with the technology that we have. So we're really ignoring a whole sector of society when we think about children, and children are one of the main victims of identity theft. And so we're doing some research around, what would biometrics look like for children? Who would hold those biometrics? What is the right biometrics? How do we collect it? And how do these biometrics change? And would it be stable enough to be useful to have foundational identity, much stronger than what we have today?
Thanks, Stephanie. You actually are leading into the next question around current constraints around these services. So I think we've already started to talk through kind of clear use cases that we're looking at solving. And it's not that we just know them and aren't trying to address them, but like what are the constraints that we continue to hit up against in this technology space as we're trying to address it?
I mean, again, I'll just keep rambling. There's a number of areas that we can touch on, right? And again, a lot of my focus, a lot of my work right now is around proofing, verification, fraud, and the reason being is that I find that to be really the weakest link in the whole identity chain today. What we found and what we continue to run into is that we just don't apply the right thinking when we're designing solutions and tools, right? Across the industry in particular, right? There needs to be like this equity by design thinking that gets employed, and it usually isn't. One thing I often talk about, and if you heard this before, apologies, but for those of you who haven't, is that like we in the U.S. have a heavy bias towards Anglo-Saxon names. And so what that means is that when we are constructing databases, right, because these lines are code, these are rules that are being put in place, what we end up doing is we having a favorable bias towards surnames with 6-character names in length. But if you were considering someone who's Southeast Asian heritage, who have 3-character names in length, we actually struggle with being able to appropriately categorize them within these databases. What that means is that when we are then running search algorithms that have certain biases towards these to try to do just a basic match to confirm we're getting the right person, we're missing them, which is creating false positives and then forcing them effectively into their own loop. In particular, right? The loop being they have to go in person, they have to probably get on a call center engagement in some way, shape, or form. The same thing happens with addresses and the way we go to view them. In particular, there are parts of the country that are rural by nature. They don't have mail delivered. And in particular, if you were trying to validate the address associated with the individual who claims to live there, the USPS, because they do not deliver mail there, will say it is no address found, right? That doesn't mean the person doesn't live there, especially if you're considering like tribal communities. That just means that the way the construct was currently put in place did not account for them. So it really plays into like a design thinking challenge, right? Much of what folks have been doing with digital services today is around human-centered design and how we could do better in that space. I think just generally when it comes to identity, we need to start with equity and start to evaluate really what are the gaps that have been keeping people out of the process for a long period of time and really start to knock those down in order to make sure that we can get them engaged.
So I think design's a really good word. The way things are was never designed. It just sort of happened over the past 100 years. And I think some of the gaps are just we don't communicate well. So if you look at, I think, stealing from like the cyber threat intelligence space, there's other work in DHS like secure by design. How do we look and intentionally design for things? So if you look at frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK or others, there's this understanding of like, there's a lot of, okay, things are changing, AI is going to make things worse, but it's like, okay, how do you measure and actually just diagram to say what steps, what schemes were done to exploit what, and then how do you start counting these things, and then how do you assign criticality and understanding of like, these matter more than this, even though this might be shinier. And I think moving that of understanding identity and fraud, because with cybersecurity, it's moving to continuous, that's sort of the goal. It's difficult to meaningfully red team or evaluate an identity system even once. Because, for example, if you're going to create fraudulent documents, you might go to jail, and usually testers aren't willing to go to jail to audit a system. So there's just some legal and regulatory things that make things difficult because there are no exceptions for testing baked into state or federal laws. And I think it's this, as something as simple as like get the people in the room, talk about an end-to-end problem. Like you start off with a flow of like it's an unknown person. There's who are they? Are they eligible? Money ends up somewhere. And if that goes wrong, some subset of that is fraud. And if you need to investigate that, what does it look like? How do you just tie this together, measure, and start enumerating this? And I think that's some work that we're trying to do inside the department to better understand common fraud enumeration, because right now it's difficult to even describe something once. And if 6 people describe the same thing, it's going to be like touching different parts of the elephant. They're going to describe it completely differently. So I think it's learning from other sectors and also internationally, because there's a bit of an arrogance sometimes in the US that if it's not invented here, we don't bother looking. But if you actually look at like identity excellence, it typically is foreign. A lot of countries at the nation state level have done much more than we've done here, and there's lessons we can learn from. So I think it's being open, it's communicating, it's some of the basic stuff, because we're starting from a place that there's a lot that we can do by just working together intentionally. But I think it's having that intentionality and then designing that is, I think, step sort of 1.
So I think one of the gaps, and the FIDO Alliance now announced a certification program for biometrics as well as looking at equity. They announced it yesterday, and we talked about it in the keynote this morning. But having the program is not enough. We sort of, if you build it, you will come. And I know the work that we've been doing, in terms of the study that I showed you some of the analysis from, that's fine. We've gotten the idea. We know how to do it. We know how to measure it. We've built a certification program around it. But people need to spend money in order to go through those certification programs. And why would they do that? Well, they will do that if their customers are demanding it. So as you go out and are starting to look at technologies, ask those hard questions. And those certification programs should be based on ISO standards. There are ISO standards out there. And there are different flavors of certification programs, right? Like you can, hire a lab for a one-off test, right? And then, that's, you pass your one-off test because you paid them the money. Look to how that certification program's set up. Is it an international body, right? Does it follow the standards? Is there a set of accredited labs as opposed to a single one-off test? And so if you can get there, and your customers have certified solutions, it's actually going to be easier for you, right? Because for you, now you don't have to think about what product am I going to purchase and rely on what the vendor says, is the quality of that product, right? So that's where we want to go. But if we're just announcing a certification program, right, we need people actually getting certified. And in order to get them certified, they need their return on investment. So they need you as your customers demanding it.
All right, call to action already. I think another thing is like, you all have already shared out some research. What are in a framework around human-centered design? I think one thing I also think about that sometimes human-centered design doesn't think about is kind of there's a new thought around like justice, like design justice design, where you actually are going one step further. So not just thinking about how might the user use this, but like how might it be not in their benefit as well? How can they be exploited? So I think that's something that I would also like challenge us all to also have those conversations internally with our team. But I think what are other frameworks that we should be thinking about on how we're going about this within the authentication identity and an identity space? And then I think also, Ariel, you mentioned earlier around how do we make sure that the user understands why this is needed? What is our due diligence around disclosing? And at what level and in what ways?
I'm happy to start. Kind of hitting on this note, we've been talking a lot about thinking about identity as part of the overall service design for the kind of digital delivery of public benefits programs in our context, because there's a lot of concern that when people are accessing these benefits online, that the either authentication or proofing, wherever it is in the flow, actually becomes a new requirement for eligibility, which under law, like that's actually not allowed. Congress sets the rules for eligibility in these programs. But I think that's where we're not thinking about some of these consequences of introducing technology, that it could be keeping people out. And so we've been kind of starting to really champion that as one of the narratives we're leading on, and I think really encouraging our state and local government partners to be thinking this way and thinking about how they clearly communicate that value proposition, but also things like accessibility, that not only is it required, but they're really telling people how, like, either optionality and access or things like screen readers and other assistive devices, things like that people may be using as well.
Sure. Framework. So I think I'll just describe one thing. Are people familiar here with the Identity Project out of Financial Crimes Enforcement Network? Some a little bit. So they had done some really compelling work where they looked at 3.6 million reports in 2021, suspicious activity reports, which are reports that financial institutions in the U.S. are broadly required to report for activity, as well as certain thresholds like $10,000 or above. And this is all not just like banks, but if you like gold, trading cards, whatever, if it reaches a certain value. And I found it interesting enough that decided to go partner to extend this and try to build on it. And what they'd found is like 1.6 million were related to identity fraud that totaled 212 billion-ish related. It helped to sort of quantify and use data at scale to understand, like, as a research problem. And until recently, that hadn't been the case. So its framework, I think, is looking at some of what came out of this, which is financial space is called typologies. There's like how money moves, which is money laundering typologies, and there's criminal behavior. And it's together, it's like you understand who did what to get the money in the first place, usually theft, committed fraud in some cases, and then how do they move it after the fact to like keep it. And looking at, there's some work right now in progress working on, like, you can't do everything at once. So account takeovers. Account takeovers are growing. So, but it's looking, well, how are they taking it over? And it's looking at like customer service channels, what identity evidence is being exploited, how digital is part of it, but you look at also in person, teller, kiosk like ATMs, others, and it's trying to look at a framework to say what is being exploited in a map of what is the process and the events people go through to prove they're them. Is the human actually being scammed? Because if you do something you are entitled to do because someone tricked you, that is really difficult to automatically detect. And increasingly, that's the vector that's being used, with very convincing fakes coming out and the cost and complexity of that going down. So I think from a framework, it's just trying to look at like how are the attackers actually doing it? Because the attackers don't care about standards, they don't care about compliance, they just will do what works cheaply. So I think it's just trying to look and understand there, and by framing it this and looking at not just a single investigation or a single event basis, but try to get a sense of what's just happening and also what's changing over time, like what's changing 21 to 23. So I think that's some applied work we're doing. And also just shameless plug, if anyone knows or is a good biometric research scientist, we're doing a lot of interesting work, and there's a rec open till June 3rd. So if you have questions, let me know. So shameless plug, you want to come do some research at Homeland Security, talk to me after, or let your friends know it's on the internet.
I think it's good. They do a lot of great work. So it's funny. I agree wholeheartedly in actually understanding really the purpose, the intent, the life cycle, and that's what I would call it, right? Understanding the life cycle by which an identity is being used, and like how it can be supported for good, and the different areas, touch points in which you have to engage in, whether or not you're inadvertently causing more pain for someone as part of confirming their identity, or the ways in which it gets exploited. One thing I'll throw out, though, is that I think just generally when we're talking about frameworks, measurement, right, this is an area that we're actually looking at with Kantara in particular, right, is how can we get something that folks can standardize around? Because, of course, the one thing we haven't said yet was NIST. I don't see anyone in the room for NIST. But the reality is that just generally that broad brush doesn't really go far enough in terms of trying to address these gaps and challenges. And so it's more about understanding what we can add on and provide more clarity, more guidance, more resources, if you will, to better enable folks to make more informed decisions. What I would say that is an underpinning of all of this really has to be measurement, and starting to get a practice and a discipline in place for measurement. It is non-existent in a number of cases, right? I've talked to a number of agencies. I've talked to commercial customers as well. Some folks are either just on the precipice. We have folks that are more advanced, have been doing it for 20 plus years. And then, for those who, had the blip during the pandemic, they just kind of woke up and realized they really had no information to make more informed progress. Measurement is key to being able to understand why something impacted an individual and why they were not able to get through. More importantly, if a negative activity was taking place from a fraudster or otherwise, where were you porous? Like, what do you need to manipulate? And then basically, how do you strike the right balance? The lack of measurement and the lack of transparency around what's being done with measurement is problematic just generally in this space. And it's something that we're always encouraging groups to do more around. For us, we're trying to lead by example. We're starting actually a whole series of putting out basically measurement related to the efficacy of our products, how they worked, what we've seen across our entire customer base. So, and basically saying that, like, we're on a journey, come walk this journey with us. But more importantly, it's like poke holes at it and say, hey, you guys weren't perfect here. Okay, this is what we're going to try to do to make up for this gap as we go forward, right? And I think that's just something we all across working in this space need to do more of.
Yeah, so the questions around frameworks, you mentioned NIST 863, I'm sure you're all aware of. There's a new draft coming out, and one of the big focuses, is around equity in that framework and around measurement. And I'm proud that with the FIDO Alliance that we're tracking that. And so not only can you say, look, here's the framework that we're working on, but here's the certification that goes along with it. And so I think that's a framework to keep an eye on. There's also our more general AI risk framework that's also out of NIST, which is fantastic work. And then ISO standard is being published around demographic differentials, which actually was led by the team at DHS S&T. And so there's things you can point to and look at, but there's still more work to be done, right? Because there's technologies that don't necessarily fit into those buckets that we're looking at next.
All right. So last question will be around either what are ways, I think we're already seeing how we're using AI around in the security space and also within workflows. What other ways can we either use it or other type of emerging technologies within this space? Or what are kind of concerns that you have around that as well?
I can try. So, one thing that we're tackling right now relates to what we're calling injection attacks. So these are kind of scary types of attacks that have been mentioned multiple times throughout the couple days where what you're doing is biometrically having people say and do things that, they didn't actually say or do. And so our technology, our biometric technology can help with that, but it's really kind of an AI battle, right? Between the attackers, and kind of the good guys, right? Who are monitoring those attacks. And part of that key is liveness, right? Is sort of probing the human to ensure you've got a real human on the other side there. And so it's very much a work in progress today. And so we're working it through our research labs, with our different sponsors at CIDR, as well as moving to promote those tests, that can be done within FIDO Alliance and other government laboratories around, how well do our systems detect those attacks.
Yeah, I think we've been very interested to see where AI can be applied more on the kind of government operations side, and in particular into cybersecurity. Our colleagues at the Center for Democracy and Technology have written about really helping, especially in our kind of state and local government landscape, of using more like pattern detection in cybersecurity. And like a lot of governments don't have sophisticated cyber programs. They're not necessarily pulling on the resources from NIST or CISA, and they certainly don't have the budget that maybe a private company does around some of these things, which means a lot of the people who are trying to compromise these programs are like 10 steps ahead of the government. Can rattle off a million examples about it, but I think like very hopeful that more of the capabilities that are coming online with AI could be applied in that.
I think it's a design problem. So it's the same way that it's hard to fix passwords. So therefore, passkeys. There's other things that lots of sessions of like design better. So I think it's looking at the industrialization of fraud and understanding that increasingly it's like transnational organized crime. This is specialization of services where there's referrals, there's recruiters, there's the C-suite, there's hackers, there's access brokers, there's lots of things of people specialize in one niche and then sell that upstream or harvest things. And I think what we have to change to is like stop trying to do things that are ineffective, especially as it gets cheaper and easier, where like someone who isn't fluent in English doesn't actually have to speak good English anymore to write a good email because ChatGPT will do it for you. And the cost has just gone down. So I think it's looking at things like personally held digital credentials, so digital wallets, mobile driver's licenses, verifiable credentials. It's these things of looking at like embedding cryptography or other things that enable us of these systems like the telephone system, email, presenting your ID online, payments, others initially started from a place of high trust, people generally doing the right thing. And increasingly we've moved to like lower and lower trust. So how do we design these systems better to account for this? I think there's payments and cybersecurity have gone first. Like, have people seen the stuff like border gateway protocol and like internet routing and the changes there with trying to put PKI? Well, anyway, there's issues with that, and there's the like, let's put public key infrastructure to make sure that works. Email, there's been tons of work in 2017, 2018 to say like, you can pin it, you can cryptographically verify it, you can't spoof the domain. If you come to a .gov, you're actually interacting with a government entity. If you're going to a .com, you're not. So I think it's applying that same intentionality to understanding not just like, AI will change everything, hand wavy, but like, what does it actually mean, and how do we design that it's long lived, where you can be agile of like, okay, if post quantum encryption comes, how are we like ready to change the new algorithm and like rotate keys to change? So I think it's trying to just break it down and look and understand. If you look, like credentials live 8 to 10 years, typically passports 10 years, driver's licenses 5 to 8. So if we're looking ahead, we have to be looking at least 10, 15 years out. And how do we do this in a way and understanding the approaches that we take today will actually be good and last that long? And if we have to rotate or change things, we've actually thought about and planned how to do this, and we're not just reacting after the fact when this new bad thing happened.
Yeah, I think really when we talk about AI, right, for our company in particular, like I'm going to apply it from the fraud prevention lens, and we'll say enabling the ability to verify who someone is. And the reason being is because I view the ability to do something more equitably for someone is also a fraud problem, because in some cases we've applied this legacy rules-based approach to doing things, such a complex set of if-then-else statements. If this person lives in the U.S., then they may pass go. If they're overseas, automatically deny them. Well, that ends up translating for people like my sister-in-law who lives in Pakistan, U.S. citizen, who tried to apply for FAFSA benefits for her son who was coming back to the U.S., being told that couldn't verify who you are, likely because they had a rules engine put in place to say that because she was international at the time in a certain country, she wasn't able to move forward. They then had to get on a plane, her son, her husband, fly into the U.S. to then present themselves in person with documentation to then wait a couple of weeks in order to be able to confirm who they were, so that they can then go back overseas. Right? Like that's how that plays out when you take that legacy approach. AI allows you to automate a lot of the thinking around it and get to more of a probabilistic determination on who someone is, and you start to manage then based off of risk for an individual. This can also translate into things like making up for problems or things that are already broken, right? So if you pull out your driver's license, I don't know how many of you are, I'm going to say, disruptive with your ID cards or not necessarily protective of them. Mine in particular, the back is smudged towards the barcode in particular. Well, the challenge that creates is if you were to try to use some type of verification technology to confirm who they are, you could probably not, they would have an issue being able to validate the driver's license because the barcode was messed up. The remedy in old school lens would be to go back to the DMV, wait in line, because we all love to do that, and then get a new one issued, right? Who really has the time for that, especially if you're working shift work and you are trying to feed a family, right? Like that's just not going to happen. In particular, things like Gen AI we've used in order to recreate the barcode in particular, by understanding what a good barcode looks like, understanding the propensity of like what may have been smudged, and learning over thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions in order to be able to do that, right? So it can be used in both lenses, right, to help people better get through the process, but then also try to cut out some of the gaps that have long left people out being able to engage.
All right, so we'll go ahead and end at that note. We're out of time. Thank you so much for coming.